I'm Charlotte Leslie, Director of the Conservative Middle East Council. In the latest of CMEX podcasts since the beginning of US-Israeli strikes on Iran and Iran's retaliation, I'm speaking to two British expats living and working in Dubai for their perspective on what's happening in the city they now call home, in the region, and how the UK's response looks to those living under the daily threat of airstrikes. Simon Penney is former Trade Commissioner for the Middle East and Consul General to Dubai. In 2023, he returned to the private sector. Simon has spent the majority of his career in the banking sector in the region and has lived in the UAE for 17 years. Marcus Booth is a partner of a leading international law firm in the EMEA Corporate M&A team. He is a Conservative Party treasurer and co-chair of the Business and Entrepreneurs Forum of the Conservative Party. Simon and Marcus, thank you very much for joining us. First, can I ask you both how it feels to live under a sudden and very different reality from that which we had even a month ago? Simon, if I can come to you first.
Well, thank you, Charlotte, and thanks for having me on the podcast. Look, it's a really interesting question, because if we were having this conversation this time last week, I'd have said, what are you talking about? 7 days is a long time. I think it caught everybody by surprise, all the 240,000 odd British people here, but don't forget there are about 9 million expatriates out of a population of 10 million people in the UAE more broadly. So most people are here out of choice, but most people are here working. And one of the things we've always taken for granted is our safety and security, because it's one of the key pillars upon which Dubai and the UAE and the broader Gulf actually has been built. So when that was shaken quite violently on Saturday evening, it caught everybody by surprise, not surprisingly. And, we saw a sort of a fairly intensive period over sort of Saturday evening going into Sunday morning. But in all honesty, since Sunday evening, Monday, things have really returned to normal, as much as normal can be. So, I would say it's a strange situation. The big unknown, of course, is what happens next. But that's not something the UAE or I or anyone else can control in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I was hosting some friends in the house. It was a perfectly quiet. They were there with their families, 2 babies actually, and my parents were here at the time. They're elderly and they left just yesterday. But we were having a perfectly normal family day, and then I got a message. He's only gone and done it, or whatever was the message. And then some hours later that we were hearing the sonic boom, which is the noise that is made as a ballistic missile is shot down by the UAE's air defences. And one thing I would say is that the question of what next becomes very real on a day-to-day basis, because I think on Saturday night and Sunday night and again on Monday, aimed at different parts of the UAE and allegedly at US targets, there have been very intense periods of activity where the UAE forces have done an amazing job intercepting 99% of the various various missiles and drones that have been directed in this direction. And there's a sort of I remember Sunday morning I woke up, it had been a quiet night, and then 9:30 there was suddenly a period of activity outside. And I would just say for me it's been quite profoundly life-changing in that respect, because I think it is easy for people to call for these things, in Britain or elsewhere, oh yes, let's sort of go and send the bombers. But when you're living under, even though the most protective shield imaginable, the sort of what next, what's going to happen this evening, what's going to happen tomorrow, we might be all right now, that becomes very real and can be unsettling. Although I must say, I'm sure you would say the same, Simon, I feel safe and I feel protected by the military and military government here.
I think one of the things that was most surprising actually was, in the very first few hours, you heard a lot of explosions, or as Marcus described, like sonic booms, and most people took that for bombs that were landing. So there was this fear that we were not only under attack, but those attacks were on buildings, on people. That clearly wasn't the case, but that wasn't apparent immediately. So you would hear these big bangs going off, and I think that created obviously a lot of fear amongst the population, but very quickly it became apparent, as Marcus says, that those bangs were actually the sound of the UAE defence actually taking out the incoming missiles. So yeah, they've done an incredible job here at intercepting incoming ballistics.
Is there a sense that a brilliant job has been done so far, but there's only so long that the air defences can hold out? Because that's been something that's been vaguely discussed on the peripheries here in the UK.
I mean, people. I've seen all sorts of reports on that. The UAE government has been very clear on its ability to continue to sustain the level of defence, and I think nothing to the contrary. I mean, suggests otherwise. Clearly, I welcome your view, Simon, and you probably know far more than me. But clearly, this is something that the UAE have anticipated. I can't. The UAE has endured more aerial strikes than Israel and all the other Gulf states combined, and yet has continued to repel them. And there were some last night, but again they were repelled. And I think that they have been prepared for this, eventuality, and I think they have prepared in a remarkable way. Would be my view, Simon.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I mean, none of us would be able to comment on the sort of the level of stockpiles, but all of the information that's been coming out of the government here is there should be absolutely no worry that there are sufficient stockpiles of interceptor missiles to deal with incoming attacks. I think interestingly, and I think what I found was quite an interesting statistic actually, cost-wise. For each of these projectiles that these interceptors that the UAE is firing, Patriot missiles and THAAD interceptors, they cost anywhere between $10–15 million a pop, and the cost of an incoming drone is about $50,000 to $70,000. So there's a multiple here in cost in terms of defending yourself against a fairly cheap, actually, form of attack in drones. And the big question, again, that no one knows is just what the stockpile of drones is that the Iranians have within their arsenal. So it's very hard to sit here today and really know and speculate, but there's clearly an asymmetric value here in terms of the cost of defending yourself. But as Marcus says, the evidence and the rhetoric is incredibly strong in that regard in terms of the ability to continue to defend. And I think allies will continue to defend and support if it were ever needed.
Yeah.
And as we record, there are discussions, certainly on social media, taking place, pointing out that Ukraine has developed much cheaper anti-drone capabilities because the Shahad drones are Iranian, and so they've had significant experience of it. And that there may be some kind of deal to be done between Ukraine, even though it's in a war zone, sharing its expertise with countries now dealing with drone as opposed to sort of ballistic missile attacks to save expensive interception capability.
Yeah, I'm sure that's absolutely right.
Can I ask, I mean, both of you work at high level in business and law. To what extent is it business as usual, or has everything stopped because of the uncertainty?
Very much business as usual. I mean, I think I was thinking about this just before this, actually, in terms of a work pattern. I remember COVID, and this is, and we are following the advice. That's what we're doing as a firm. But I remember there was a sudden series of activity. What does it mean for us internally? What does it mean for our clients? What does it mean that, and all those questions you asked. And then gradually life returned to normal, and COVID we actually had a very busy period when lots of things went on hold for a while. I think it's too early to assess the long-term effects of this. I mean, I'm a lawyer, so there will, as long as there's activity one way or the other, there's often the cause for lawyers and people be looking at their contractual obligations, even in a time of conflict. But as far as clients are concerned, it's business as usual. And those clients are locals, citizens, expats, and we will not know where this goes for a little while in terms of its really long-term effect for a region that, let's face it, has been in the last 2 or 3 years the focus of so much of the world's economic attention and growth and hope.
Simon, you were Consul General and Regional Trade Commissioner during sort of the previous big crisis, which, as Marcus points out, was COVID. Obviously, a very different type of threat. Are there similarities? Have we learned lessons from that global event that took place?
I think we've learned lessons as to how well the Gulf and within it the UAE can respond. And, building on what Marcus just said, I think you sort of got to look at it almost in sort of different scenarios, but clearly we have a short-term scenario, in terms of what is going to happen in the next day, days and weeks. And to a large extent, that depends on what happens outside of the UAE. I mean, these are not events really that are of the UAE's making. They're events that are happening, across the Gulf in Iran. But I think in that shorter window period, which is the window we're now in, investors, they may pause decisions. I mean, don't forget, you can't even fly here still today. The sort of the commercial routes are still closed, although they are operating repatriation flights. So will investors pause decisions? Possibly. Will developers delay launches? Possibly. This economy has been built up very much on real estate and within it construction. Hospitality. I mean, Dubai in particular has been built up around its hospitality offer, around its hotels and the ability of Emirates and other airlines to bring passengers in. I think 25 million people came here on holiday last year. So in the short term, will tourism be impacted? Absolutely, absolutely yes. The question then is what happens next? And again, that depends on what happens outside of the UAE. And if tensions stabilize very quickly, then in my experience, things will return to normal quite quickly. The question then is what happens if the conflict persists? And in that situation, I think a prolonged conflict would have, far deeper implications, particularly for business. Because, as I mentioned earlier on, the UAE's sort of success as a global hub has really depended on its reputation as a sort of a stable platform for international capital, whether that be financial capital or human capital, trade, foreign direct investment. So I think if it were to if it were to continue for an extended period of time, there is a risk that companies, investors might gradually look at sort of diversifying their exposure, not exiting, but diversifying. So maybe not having so much regional concentration risk in any one country. And so, I must stress, I don't see this as an exit at all, but maybe just a broadening of companies' focus to sort of to reduce risk. But I find it hard to believe sitting here that the UAE's hub status, because this is a hub, it's a global hub, it's not a regional hub, it's a global hub. And I find it hard to believe that certainly in the medium term, and even looking into the long term, that hub status will be challenged in any real way. And I think for businesses who may be listening to this podcast, as Marcus described it with lawyers, you always need a lawyer in good times and bad. I think as some industries and some sectors may take a pause or may slow down, others will grow. Think of the opportunities that may exist in the security sector, in the defence sector, which is a big focus here for defence industries. There's been a lot of focus on cyber and data. I think these are industries which will continue, albeit in maybe a slightly different format. So I think it's a really opportune time as much as it is an uncertain time. And the businesses that do really well will be the ones that play that short term versus long term and adjust their strategies to the changing status.
Marcus, right at the beginning of the podcast, you said that you learned the news by getting a text with someone saying, "Oh, he's only gone and done it," i.e. referring to Trump initiating Operation Epic Fury. Is there anger about what's going on? And if so, is it directed at Trump because everything was business as usual until he started Operation Epic Fury? Or is it at Iran for retaliating against Gulf states, which was perhaps not expected even by those Gulf states themselves, especially I think of Oman?
I mean, overwhelming anger and surprise at Iran, right? Because, I mean, I appreciate that Iran is sort of lashing out in every sort of possible direction at the moment. But, the UAE was against, speaking from a UAE perspective, was publicly against any intervention like this by the United States and Israel, and has counseled and continue to urge for a diplomatic solution. So the last time round, there was maybe a bit more expectation someone would have. I think we were aware of the US build-up in the Gulf, but I think there is general bewilderment, and there is anger with Iran. A feeling of anger that they are targeting the UAE and the other Gulf states in such a way, and I think that the Gulf states and the GCC have spoken with one voice on this, and they have been remarkably restrained. I mean, you have a situation whereby, I haven't got the exact figures in front of me, I did them moments ago, but almost 200 ballistic and cruise missiles have been thrown at the UAE, not to mention over 500 drones. And the UAE is ostensibly neutral in this power. I mean, it's not something that Switzerland had to suffer during the Second World War. So the UAE is continue to call for de-escalation. I just speak personally, I hope that the president and his allies have a plan in what they're seeking to achieve. And that may be unclear. I was listening to something where apparently it is clear, but I think at the moment, when you are, I mean, no one here has asked for this conflict, and there may be very good reasons as to why the offensive has taken place, but there is certainly anger here in the Gulf states at the Iranian response, which of course has caused civilian, luckily very few casualties, and I think maybe 3 deaths or something in the UAE at the moment. Deeply sad, but it's there's anger at that.
Simon.
Yeah, I mean, there's not really a huge amount to add there. I guess when you sort of talk about anger, you've got sort of the ordinary person on the street who probably didn't really have a huge amount of understanding or knowledge of sort of the build-up that had been happening over the last sort of number of weeks. And I think probably, were taken by surprise as much as any when, missiles started landing on Saturday. I think, I spoke a little bit about short-term and long-term. I think sort of the bit that sort of, worries me the most actually is what does the long term look like? Because, unlike COVID, where you can find a vaccine and, everybody takes it and they feel like that they can sort of return to normal life in a short period of time, that is not the case here. And there are a number of scenarios that can play out in Iran, because ultimately that is what we're talking about here. What is the future for Iran? And you could have extremes. You could have a civil war. You could have the army defecting and aligning themselves, say, with demonstrators. So there's a popular uprising that sees an overthrow of the regime. How likely is that? I don't know. You could have a scenario where the sort of the Islamic Republic, as is today, staggers on under new leadership. Trump is very clear that again is not an ideal scenario. A scenario where they form a democratic government, again, improbable. So whichever way you look at the various scenarios that may exist, there's no one that has any high degree of certainty sitting here today. I mean, I've seen reports over the last 24 hours that there may well have been some outreach from the Iranians to the Americans. Again, who knows? But that plays into any one of those 4 or 5 scenarios until we get clarity on that direction. And I don't even know what I mean by clarity, because I don't think we're going to get a single point of clarity. It's going to be very hard to determine what it means for the Gulf and how quickly the Gulf countries can return to, the degree of normality, if ever they can in the near term, and sort of continue the direction of travel they were on before the weekend.
Now, I said one thing that is very clear, Charlotte, is that this is not Venezuela, right? I mean, the Maduro thing, over and down the new government, the Iranian regime, in its own words, is sort of fighting on and continuing. So again, things could resolve quite quickly, but it could equally go on for a very long time, with all the consequences that has for the region and the world in particular as well.
I mean, if we look at America's track record on attempted leadership, regime change, you can call it regime change, you can call it importing democracy, it's not gone massively well, has it? And I guess that's why Trump came in and said, I'm not going to be a George W. Bush. One of my Republican friends in the US texted me in despair and said, Netanyahu has turned Trump into George W. Bush, referring to the fact that he's now seems to be keen on foreign adventures and regime change. Is there a skepticism and an alarm that America is repeating previous mistakes that Trump had said he wouldn't repeat? Or does this feel different to, I don't know who I'm asking about, but Emiratis, Brits in particular abroad? Is there general support for what Trump's doing?
Again, this is a personal view. I think the answer to that would be no. And I think most people would answer that question rather parochially, and that is it has sort of unleashed uncertainty around their safety and security. Therefore, they would not be in support of the sort of the immediate consequences of it. If you look forward and longer term, the objectives, obviously, and although Trump has now reined back from that earlier comment, it has been about, one, regime change, and second, ensuring that Iran doesn't get its hand on a nuclear weapon. I'm pretty certain, and you still hear it out of the US only yesterday, that those remain principal objectives. And, if they were to happen and they were to carry through in the way I described, then I think that would would result in a more peaceful and stable region. But I think the likelihood of that happening, for the reasons you just described, Charlotte, are low. I mean, history doesn't look favorably on these types of adventures when you're seeking to change a regime either from afar or, as the US is talking about, from the air.
Yeah, I mean, again, speaking personally, I was opposed to the Iraq War, and I think I was right to have been opposed to the Iraq War. And at the time, I felt that the stated aims were wrong. Not that I, of course, supported the regime that was in there in place. And what worries me is that uncertainty. And it's not that sometimes going to war is the right or the wrong thing to do, but history has taught us that whilst my concern, I would say, is that history has taught us that whilst bombing campaigns can achieve one thing, and regime change as a result, I see as a result of a mere bombing campaign without planning as not unlikely, but whether that will happen in the way that anyone expects, as you say, Simon, it could be civil war, it could be all sorts of uncertainties. But also, you cannot defeat I think this is a lesson of history. You cannot defeat an ideology by a bomb campaign. And if that is the strategy, that somehow you are going to defeat the ideology of the regime in Tehran by the use of aerial attacks, I just don't see that it will work. And it is highly possible that this conflict could continue in a very different way, even outside the Middle East, because I think you do not bomb an ideology out of existence, and that's my concern, and I very much hope that the president has a plan and that he knows why he begun this with the Israelis. But anyway, we'll see.
And even a plan that involved boots on the ground, which clearly is not something that is being suggested. Even a plan with boots on the ground is absolutely no guarantee of success, as we've seen in Iraq. So it is quite hard to see that if there isn't the stated aim of regime change and the government reforms in its current state with new leadership, then things bumble along. And I think that's a real worst case scenario in many respects, because it solves nothing but has created huge uncertainty, not only for the people of Iran, which we mustn't forget behind all of this, but also for the stability of the region.
Turning to domestic politics and our reaction to this, it's one of the analogies that's been raised in the chamber and inevitably will be is the 2003 Iraq war and our involvement in it. And obviously it's always dangerous to draw too close analogies to history. But like Marcus, I was very opposed to it. It's in fact the thing that got me involved in politics. And the thing I noticed then was that very intelligent, well-informed, well-meaning people who were very close to the debate, generally parliamentarians, seem to have one view of the validity of Britain's involvement in the US incursion into Iraq. And those slightly more distant actually had a better perspective, that proximity doesn't always mean that you see things more clearly. Mm. Is there a danger now that the closer, I think of the Conservative Party, but I think of all political parties, the closer parties are to the centre of discussions, and particularly the US and the special relationship, the less clearly they see it, and that those perhaps a little bit more distant, and particularly people living in the region, might see this with a bit more historical context and be slightly more sceptical about blindly following the US into whatever new adventure it wants to go into. It's a long way of saying, should we be a bit more careful about interpreting the special relationship as simply blindly following the US? Simon.
Yeah, look, I mean, let me try and tackle that from this end, because I guess in some respects we have proximity at this end, and we could be accused of the same thing, that we're too close to the way of thinking here. So I get that, actually, because having lived here as long as I have, you do start thinking a little bit as much about how the Gulf sees things as how the UK sees things, and we do need to see things and be very clear-eyed about that. I mean, what I can say, and I saw this firsthand as Trade Commissioner, is that the countries of the Gulf hold the UK in incredibly high regard. There's a real strong warmth of history, but I would say that over recent years and decades, the UK has become more detached from the region and has become, maybe it's wrong to say less dependable, but there are probably more dependable countries now to the Gulf than the UK once was. And I think that's something the Gulf countries have felt. And it's something that I spent a lot of time as Trade Commissioner trying to ensure that the government of the day when I was Trade Commissioner understood the power and the importance of personal relationships and the sensitivities. And I think that's something that's been lost. We have the great advantage of history that our relationship's not transactional here. And I think we're losing our ability to connect and use that softer power, which is something we were so well known for. And I still think it's not lost forever. We do have, a very good Foreign Office actually that has people who have the ability through proximity to be able to advise far better than I think they're given credit for doing. So I think we've got assets, we've got access to relationships, we've got access to information, but I don't feel, and I didn't feel it in the previous government, and I can't say necessarily now, but I suspect that actually the voices that could help shape some of that perception that you're thinking about how things land, how important those relationships are for the long-term health of the UK, I think they're being lost. And just finally on that point, I was so, genuinely very impressed by the way the Gulf countries treat bilateral government relationships, that their relationships, it's not just built around one axis, it's not just built around trade or investment or defence or security, it's the totality of the relationship. And if the UK is really going to sort of, enhance and improve and get back where it got to, it's got to view these as holistic relationships that are built around people and trust. And ultimately, trust is something I think, and confidence in the UK has been eroded over the last years and decades.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I mean, I would go a little further to say that from where I sit, the response of the UK has been entirely underwhelming. I mean, we had Ed Davey and I think some of the standing up, I know he's the Liberal Democrat, but standing up in Parliament making, really very insensitive comments lacking in any compassion for the British citizens over here, but talking about the citizens being defended by the UK. So as I understand it, the UK don't have a warship in the region. Struggling. They've been criticised today by Cyprus. It's another week before the UK send anything. I'm not quite clear. So we're not sort of. As I'm saying, as a British citizen, I'm not quite clear exactly what the UK is doing to defend us. And I'm reading one of the newspapers locally, and there are three sort of headlines in quick succession. France has sent 6 extra Rafale jets to the UAE. Italy sending air defences, and then the UK, a charter flight from Muscat is delayed due to technical issues. So it's sort of underwhelming for a state that has such a long history. Up until independence, of course, the UK was a UK protectorate, the trucial states here, and so the UK has such a lot of history, such a lot of goodwill. And in times of vulnerability, people or times of attack, people turn around to an ally. And I would just say that underwhelming perhaps is kind at the moment for the current response. And whatever the rhetoric, Charlotte, coming out of London, I fear again further long-term damage. I think it is relevant to this, but look at Diego Garcia, look at the Chagos Islands, look at the way that has been handled, look at the response in Washington, never mind the human rights of the Chagosians themselves. And it just adds up to a feeling that the government doesn't exude, one of confidence and coherence. I mean, we hear that about legal arguments, but let's hear more confidence from the UK and coherence, I would say.
Are there any messages that politicians, obviously we're the Conservative Middle East Council, so thinking particularly of Conservatives, any messages that leadership can give out to reassure that our Gulf allies, because it's not just a special relationship with the US, we have our allies in the region as well, would like to hear to make them feel reassured that we do value those relationships? What should we be saying?
There's two things, there's actions and words. I think we've just been speaking about the actions, and as Mark has said, I think the actions everyone can see from the outside looking in would seem underwhelming. Words, I can't comment on what words are being had behind closed doors, but I'm pretty certain, based on my experience, that there would have been a lot of back channels between the government and the UAE authorities. So it'd be hard to be critical or otherwise on that. But my overriding message is we have to wake up and realize that our relationships cannot be short-term tactical relationships on matters that only to matter to us at a point in time. At the moment, the Gulf, and within it the UAE, is under threat, has been under attack, and they will remember, as anybody would, who their friends were in bad times as well as good. And it gets back to my point, is you have to see the relationship in its totality, not just through a single lens. So to answer your question specifically on what could and should the Conservative Party do, my overwhelming advice is don't wait. I mean, you have to engage. You have to build those relationships. Relationships are built on trust. You can't just engage at the 11th hour in a time of crisis. So, our own MPs, the party, has time to start building those relationships up that can become stronger in the future. But if it's short-term, tactical, I fear that it's not going to land in the same way that we would all like.
Totally agree. And this is a time of international crisis, whatever way you look at it. And the reason I was critical of one UK politician earlier is you cannot at this stage do government by headline, or even worse, government by legal analysis. And I think that the broader picture has to be, as Simon said, focus very much on the long term. And I think I said I speaking personally, had been underwhelmed by what I perceive as the UK's response. What I would say is, from now there on in, it is very important, I think, for the UK and for its long-term credibility in the Gulf states and beyond as to what it does here. And it can sit on the sidelines, and I'm not talking about military intervention, but it can sit on the sidelines and be irrelevant, or it can play a constructive role in resolving this whole thing positively. And at the moment, I fear we're going to do the former rather than the latter.
Simon Penney and Marcus Booth, thank you very much for your insights from Dubai. And if we may, as things develop, we may come back to you again to see how your opinions have shifted and indeed how the situation's developed. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.